understand each other's point of view. Even if we don't agree with it, we engage with those we disagree with, looking for common ground and ways to work together. We also support principles that bring us together rather than divide us. Braver Angel seeks to depolarize American politics. Our work is rooted in grassroots organizing. From the grassroots, however, our volunteer leaders, who are supported by a small staff, leverage Braver Angels programs and unique organizing structure in order to impact community life in American institutions. Our public forum tonight features a panel discussing various aspects of political polarization, including its causes, influence, impacts, and solutions. Mary Hunt will be moderating for us tonight. Glenn White, a local psychologist, will report on what social sciences research has to say about polarization. Jerry Henderson, a retired psychologist, will explore the latest thinking among political scientists and others about how polarization can have detrimental impacts on democratic governments. And April Chatham Carpenter, UA Little Rock professor in applied communications, will focus on various communication practices that can help us improve our political conversations. Attendees will be able to pose questions to the panel via chat. We do ask that if you do have questions, that you do them in that chat box, and that at the appropriate time, I will be able to present those questions to the panel. So without further ado, let's get started.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeannie. You said my name's Mary Hunt. I'll moderate this discussion. Each panelist will have about 15 minutes. So, and at the end of that, then we'll go to your chat, as she said. So please don't hesitate to enter in your questions as you hear they're talking. Enter in it at any time. Okay. So we first start with Dr. Glenn White. Glenn.
Yes, ma'am.
What are some ideas from your research on problems related to political polarization?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to just let people know I did not do the research myself. This is the kind of research where you do some reading and looking at references and thought leaders and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm going to be delivering on tonight. But I've been doing that for about pretty much about 4 years now. I've been trying to look and understand about polarization, political belief, and that sort of thing. Let me start first with just making sure we understand why polarization is such a problem. Extreme polarization, and Jerry is going to say a lot more about this when it's his turn, but it's very dangerous for our democracy and our society. So we have to, be concerned about it for that reason. One of the reasons for that is just the fact that our country is a lot more diverse than it used to be. We have many more ethnic groups. There's more of a variety of religious affiliations or even no religious affiliations. And when you have different viewpoints, it can lead to polarization among the political parties, and that's what's happened to us. And with that comes a lack of problem solving, more win-lose thinking. And as a result, our government has not been nearly as functional by most estimations lately. And so that leads to more identification with the party and so on. So things don't get done and people get tired of it, and things get kind of ugly. It can even lead to social unrest, suspicion, even in worst cases, violence. And if you look at other countries, a lot of things can happen, including even up to the worst case scenario of civil war. Hopefully that won't happen here, but it is not something you can rule out just because we're the U.S. and it's gone well so far. We've already had one civil war.
Glenn,
yes,
we forgot to do the pre-poll, and I don't know if you wanted to do that before we get too far in.
Well, you know what? I will finish this thought, which is that things can happen different ways with civil war or just low-level sniping verbally. But my point is that at some point, every functional country gets back around, maybe even after thousands or millions of deaths, to dialogue and compromise. And so we might as well start with that and skip the death part, hopefully. So before I get to the research, let's go to April. She's got a poll for us.
Yeah, we're going to offer these questions both at the beginning and the end. I think there's one additional question at the end, but let's just, and this is anonymous, so I'm going to launch it here, and I think everybody but the co-host can actually take it. Do you all see the poll? Are you able to see it? All right, so if you'll just take a minute to take that, and then I'll show the results of that. I think there are 5 questions on it. That's 60% of the people that have voted, so getting close.
We've just had a couple more people admitted into our meeting as well.
I don't know if they'll be able to see the poll, but I hope they will.
If you do see the poll, go ahead and take it if you can. We'll probably be ending it shortly. 5 questions.
I'm gonna give us about another 40 seconds here, and
Looks like it's been on 17 for a while.
18.
Oh, there's 18. Okay.
Wish we'd get 81% of our population to vote for the next election. That'd be amazing.
Boy, that'd be wonderful.
Just might.
Yeah,
That's
Josh
true.
is right. We're not a representative sample. Yeah.
All right. Do you think I should close it off, Glenn?
I'd close it.
All right. So let's share the results here. And Glenn, I know you wanted to take screenshots of this so that we'd have this, so you might remember to do that.
Thank you for the reminder.
So it looks like most of you are somewhat knowledgeable about political polarization. At least you think you are. We'll see if we actually move that needle up a little bit by the end here. And again, we get mostly political views based on sound information and a rational decision process, but not everyone. And then have a tie between, on the third one, I believe our democracy and way of government will withstand the current high polarization. It's maybe and maybe not. Interesting. I have high confidence in my ability to have a respectful and effective conversation, and we kind of move in there between the probably and the maybe. So hopefully you'll learn some things about that tonight. And then your current knowledge of various techniques, looks like we've got the most common answer of moderate knowledge and ability in terms of being able to talk to somebody of a different view than yours that can, in a way that would reduce polarization. So thank you so much. All right, I'll turn it back to Mary here.
All right. So Glenn, had you finished on your first point? I've got another question on Dr. Jonathan Haidt's views.
Yeah, no, I was actually just about to get started. That other was the preface.
Okay.
So
Okay.
watch my time on this. Okay, looking at the research and what it says that contributes to polarization, the first thing to understand, the thing that was kind of amazing to me when I started reading on this, is how much our decisions and our beliefs and our positions are determined not by our rational, sifting through of facts and coming to sound conclusions, but rather through emotional, social, largely subconscious influences. Some examples, if you think about it, how much we are influenced by what our peers think, and yet we don't always realize that's actually why we're making decisions. But we also have things like the emotions. Fear and anger will impact our behavior and how we look at things. Fear and anger also, by the way, will cause us to dig into our beliefs and basically make us impervious to facts in many ways. And then because of something related to tribalism, which we'll talk here shortly, there's a tendency to have a negative, fearful response to people not in our tribe. And then you've got something that psychologists call social modeling, which is simply the kind of idea that you learn by what you see other people do. And so when you observe other people doing things, that's a very powerful form of learning. Now that's especially important in politics because politicians and government officials are prominent, they are in the media a lot. So what we see them do tends to lead many of us to mimic that behavior. It's a strong way of learning. Another piece of the puzzle has to do with what's often called tribalism, which is also group identity, what group you identify with. Jerry's going to cover this in more detail along with governmental issues, but I'll give you an example. Back around the time of the 2016 presidential election, Gallup poll asked Americans from both parties what their views were of the economy and was it good or bad, that kind of thing. They did a poll the week before the election and a week poll after the election. And guess what happened? Democrats and Republicans flipped their perceptions of the health of the economy in 2 weeks. Now, do you think the economy changed in 2 weeks? Of course not. So what they were doing was, it's that tribal influence that because someone out of the other party now has control, well, the economy is lousy, or the economy is much better because my man got in. So this group identity really is a key influence on our decisions and beliefs, and actually tends to outweigh facts, logic, and values many times. We're not helpless against that tendency, but it's a very strong tendency. And it comes about because we're social animals. We all, like other social animals, need to be around other people and to belong to a group. That's good in a lot of ways, but the downside of belonging to a group and having allegiance to that group is that we tend to start having kind of suspicions and concerns about people who are the other, people who are not in our group. We automatically have a little bit of hesitancy about them. One of the things to do about that I'll mention later is just basically try to identify with a bigger tribe. If you're identifying with a political party now, try to identify with being an American or a member of the human race or something like that. Another little interesting thing is just differences in cultures are important. Sociologists often talk about the difference between we cultures, which is like the Eastern countries, like Asian countries, things like that, where they tend to have much more of a group-oriented culture, doing things for the common good, as opposed to Western countries, particularly America, which is a me culture, doing more what's good for the individual, and that can weigh into things as well. So all these social and cultural influences are important. Then you have brain and cognitive influences. Our brains, most people believe now who study this say that our brains evolved over time to develop certain shortcuts in making decisions because you get so much information, it's just too much work to try to sift through everything. So coming up with shortcuts can sometimes be an efficient way to make a decision. However, that is the downside to that is you're more susceptible to bias or to being misinformed. So that's a problem. And then another thing is we all know about the fight-flight response. You know, when we get emotional, when we get scared or angry, the fight-flight response kicks in. And when we're doing that, we're using a different part of the brain that's a little more primitive and is basically designed to keep us alive by fighting or running from whatever danger it is. We still have the higher level intellectual, rational part but it tends to then be kind of recruited by the lower level to help us get out of that situation. So in essence, one might argue that your IQ is lowered when emotion gets into the picture. Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist and economist. He won the Nobel Prize a few years ago over research just on this very thing with relation to economics. He talks about there being two brain systems, a fast processing system and a slow. The fast is that kind of fight, flight, or really entrenched instinctual kinds of stuff, as well as things that we have learned, have developed into habits or entrenched beliefs. That's the fast stuff. So we don't spend time thinking about it. It just comes automatically. The slow part of the brain processing is when we're using all of our faculties. We're using facts, rational logic, and our values, but that requires more time and energy. So if you want to make better decisions, slow down in your thinking. An interesting way of looking at this is psychologist named Kaplan says the brain has an immune system very much like the body does. It tends to reject ideas that are different than what we believe or that are not typical of our tribe. It actually even has been shown to activate parts of the brain that are involved in pain. So basically, you get an idea that's new to you or different from your ideas, chances are your brain's going to say, don't pay attention to that. That's not good. That's not healthy. Run from it. And then we've got media influences. Media is getting to be kind of the whipping boy these days. To some extent, that's true. You know, if you think back when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, there were 3 networks, and that was it. And those 3 networks all had, you know, news groups that were basically loss leaders. They did not try to make money off of the news. And so they appealed to a broad common denominator. And so it was fairly solid stuff and middle of the road things. But now you've got a proliferation of literally hundreds of sources or more of media, so that you've got a source or many sources of media for each viewpoint. The standards of accuracy have gone down. People are more willing to kind of go in a whole different direction, and there's more money motivation, so that even the news now makes its money by bringing people in. And one thing we know when it comes to emotion in news is that old quote, if it bleeds, it leads. So the more emotionally based or evoking fear or anger that the news is, the more people are going to pay attention to it, and that means more money for the network that's doing that. So now we have a chance to basically pick our sources of information, and we're naturally drawn to the ones that fit our beliefs, our tribe. And the bad part about that is then it tends to confirm our beliefs, and we don't get to hear other sides, and so we're viewing reality from a very narrow basis. Also, people have gotten a lot more used to how to use propaganda techniques and misinformation. That's become much more sophisticated. But you know, the basic idea behind propaganda isn't too difficult. You repeat a lie often enough, people eventually come to believe it. And then we've got social media, Facebook and Twitter and that sort of thing. And you've probably heard about the algorithms that they have that determine what stuff you see that comes through on your feed. What it does is it's picking things that fit with your tribe and your beliefs, and it's also feeding you things that'll get you riled up, because that's the kind of thing that keeps you engaged and watching and looking and interacting with it. So it's actually been shown to be designed just like the slot machines in Vegas and other places, that it's highly addictive. So there are some real problems with media, although I would urge you to consider there are several very good quality news sources still, but you have to pick them and use your head for that. Okay, Mary.
Oh, okay, Glenn. We're coming up on time at 6:30 at this point.
Okay.
Do you want to address the Dr. Jonathan Haidt's views?
I'll do that just very briefly and then move to the last, and then how's that?
Okay.
So Dr. Jonathan Hyatt has an excellent book called The Righteous Mind. It was one of the things that influenced me, and he's a psychologist that's done a lot of work on moral development research. Here's the basic metaphor when we're talking about so much of our decision making being based on unconscious or emotional or social motivations. He says our decision making is like a rider on an elephant. The elephant represents our largely unconscious and emotional and tribal factors that lead us to decide a certain way. So in this metaphor, the elephant is walking along and it goes in a certain direction. The rider, which represents the higher level rational part of the brain, doesn't actually determine which way the elephant does. It's the emotional stuff. That's what the elephant represents. So the rider's job is not to steer the elephant. The rider's job is to come up with a rational, plausible explanation for why the elephant chose to go that way. And if you don't like that metaphor, here's another one. Think of a president's press secretary. The press secretary's job is not to determine reality and tell you what the truth is. It is to give the truth according to the president and to do your best dance to justify why that's right. So that's another way to look at it. One other thought I will mention briefly is that this idea of competing goods. This is important in polarization. With competing goods, this is the idea that both sides tend to demonize the other when they have a different idea. But if you really go down close and look at their views and values, they each have very good ideas, but one good idea tends to not fit with the other idea. And so they demonize the other side when in fact they both have good points. What's needed is a balancing of those two. For example, security versus freedom. We both agree security is good. We both agree freedom is a great value. But the more you move towards security, the less you have freedom. And conversely, the more you move toward maximum freedom, you start to minimize security. So it's not that you only want one or the other, you want both, but you have to find a balance, and that means compromise. And that's something that's missing in an extremely polarized society. So the last part that I was going to talk about, and I'll leave that primarily, I think, to April, but it was about how you can help and how Braver Angels can help. But I would just put in the pitch that you go to the website, www.braverangels.org, and learn about us, join for $12 a year, and go to some of the national workshops and events and apply those skills in your personal life and in your personal relationships. It may seem scary, but we have ways to help you maximize your chance of having that work out well. And if you do, you might be like Daryl Davis, who's a famous guy. He was a black man and a musician who over several years started forming relationships with people who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And by forming relationships and not getting into fights, but actually talking, he was able to actually get over 200 members of the Ku Klux Klan to give up their robes. And that's due to the power of relationships. So if I had to distill it to one thing, it'd be the power of relationships. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next one.
Okay. Thank you, Glenn. Excellent information. Okay, now we have Dr. Jerry Henderson. Jerry, for your first question, we're all Americans, so how is it possible that so much distrust and negative feelings have developed between these partisan groups? Jerry, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
I heard your question, so I'll jump in.
Good.
I suspect that most of us have felt the negative impact of polarization in some form or the other. This evening, I want to focus on polarization's impact on the health of democratic institutions generally and the implications for our own democracy. But I want to begin with a discussion of the intense group loyalty that develops when two groups compete with one another and how this relates to the seemingly irrational level of animosity between partisan groups. Many of us have probably experienced some fairly strong emotions when there was nothing more at stake than a game involving our favorite sports team. Evolutionary psychologists argue that the intense loyalty we develop as a member of a group is linked to our evolutionary history. Neuroscientists have even suggested that the human brain is specialized for adapting to group functioning. Early humans used group living as a survival strategy. We used our superior brains to combine group resources and engage in basic survival competition with both predators and tribes. This suggests that the behaviors and the emotions associated with group loyalty evolved as essential survival skills. A member was dependent on the support and protection of the group for their very survival. To put this in perspective, consider for a moment, how would you feel if you had a change of partisan heart and had to tell your red or blue group of friends that you were switching sides? Today, of course, we would survive that physically, but it would be quite an emotional challenge. The evolutionary model of group loyalty dynamics is consistent with contemporary psychological research. Threats to our partisan team from an opposing party not only elicit strong emotions, it also triggers a physiological stress response. Being ostracized by group members produces a similar pattern of brain activation to that which occurs when we are experiencing physical pain. Research indicates that there is a primal human motivation to defeat opposing groups. So, Mary, these powerful group loyalty dynamics are deeply woven into our psychological and even neurological makeup. And this contributes to the intense partisan divide, a divide that so blinds us to our common ground that it can potentially erode the health of our democracy.
So how does polarization impact the health of our democracy? What do you mean by erode?
Well, let me go with this. Start with a statistic from Freedom House. It's an organization that monitors freedom and democracy worldwide. They report that democratic institutions and civil liberties have steadily declined around the world since 2005. This decline was found in a large multi-nation research project to be linked to severe polarization. Political scientists use the term affective polarization to describe the most pernicious form of partisan division for democracies. Affective polarization involves deep distrust and disdain across the political divide. Sound familiar? Well, sure, that's exactly the type of polarization we're experiencing in America. As polarization intensifies, politicians and voters tend to start feeding off one another's negative partisan energy. Our history of tribalism becomes engaged, and the world starts feeling more and more like an us versus them partisan war. We start viewing our side as the true and righteous Americans, and those scoundrels on the other side become our enemies. The feeling can develop that they will destroy America, so we must defeat them at any cost. This attitude, we must defeat them at any cost, is particularly corrosive to democracy because it potentially provides a justification for violating democratic norms in the service of our team winning. So all is not fair in partisan war if we value the Constitution. Polarization also creates gridlock in legislative bodies, and of course, we've seen plenty of that. So, Mary, with severe polarization, democratic institutions become less efficient. Much needed legislation becomes a victim of gridlock. Consequently, citizens can become disenchanted with democratic institutions that start to appear dysfunctional. This can create fertile ground for a would-be authoritarian to exploit a nation's divisions.
So that's how it can impact the health of democracies. Are these the factors as well that lead to the erosion? Are there additional factors?
Yes. In the last 2 decades, the most common pattern of democratic decline around the world has occurred not by military coup, but by the actions of democratically elected politicians. Think about what this means. In essence, nations around the world are making the first mistake by electing an authoritarian-leaning politicians. And then the second fatal mistake, the voters fail to vote them out of office before it's too late, before the elections have fallen under control of the authoritarian government. Russia still goes through the motions of an election, but of course it's meaningless. Severe polarization can also give rise to hardball political tactics that violate long-standing democratic norms, such as institutional forbearance. This occurs when a leader violates norms by pushing their executive power to the very limit of legality. And while technically not illegal, these power maneuvers do violate the spirit of constitutional principles. Political scientists argue that honoring these norms is vital for a healthy democracy. These norms ensure public trust in institutions such as the independence of the judiciary and oversight agencies. Particularly, trust must be maintained in the integrity of the electoral process. These institutions are what democracy is built on, and we should be alarmed if norms are violated. Yet another danger of polarization is that it makes us more vulnerable to being manipulated by the current tsunami of disinformation. Humans frequently engage in motivated reasoning. This is a tendency to bend our assessment of facts toward the existing beliefs and biases rather than toward accuracy and objectivity. We humans are quite creative at discounting facts and simply believing what we want to believe. And you can bet politicians know that our partisan loyalty makes us very receptive to negative information about the opposition. Research also indicates that disinformation designed to make us angry at the other party tends to increase our partisan loyalty. So we can readily see why an aspiring autocrat would be willing to make false claims against the other side. These attacks are free, they're easy, and they can be quite effective. So Mary, we do well to keep in mind that our intense partisan loyalty can set us up to become a pawn in an aspiring autocrat's power game.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left. What are some of the warning signs that our nation, the United States, could be heading down the path of democratic erosion?
All right. Polarization sets the stage, but alone it's generally not sufficient to seriously erode democracy. The final cause often happens when a nation is experiencing some type of stressful challenge. In Russia, it was economic stress, and in Hungary, it was the influx of immigrants. Research has shown when nations are experiencing challenges, there's a tendency for voters to prefer more dominant, even aggressive politicians that confidently promise solutions to the troubled times. These have tended to be populist-style politicians, either from the left, as in Venezuela, or the right, as in Hungary. So the final causal element is a nation's election of a would-be authoritarian who is willing to exploit a country's existing polarization for political gain. Danger arises when this type of leader intensifies divisiveness and amplifies fear to galvanize loyalty of base voters. Such leaders engage in highly divisive, even inflammatory rhetoric to intensify the tribal us versus them environment toward a strategy of divide and conquer. Citizens are often encouraged to see the other side as a threat to their core values and way of life. to intensify the commitment to win. In terms of warning signs, authoritarian leaders like Putin, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Erdogan in Turkey have followed a somewhat similar playbook. Political scientists note that an aspiring autocrat, to be successful, must capture the referees. This refers to a pattern of gradually gaining control over the judicial system, law enforcement, and intelligence agencies. So the game plan is to transform obstacles of power into weapons by packing the judicial system and law enforcement agencies with loyalists. Then, instead of investigating the leader, these agencies can now be directed to go after political foes. The authoritarian playbook usually involves an assault on opposition media. Vladimir Putin silenced an opposition media company by having it investigated and charged with tax evasion. Erdogan made a very similar move in Turkey by silencing a media company for tax issues. Viktor Orban changed the appointment rules for the Constitutional Court of Hungary and subsequently packed the court with loyalists to gain control. In the early part of their administration, these politicians always employ stealth and only gradually make changes to consolidate their power. In this fashion, they avoid a strong opposition backlash that would occur if they were more bold in their anti-democratic moves. Two Harvard political scientists in their book, How Democracies Die, note that democratic erosion happens so gradually, most citizens fail to notice. Those that ring the bell of alarm are often written off as merely crying wolf. The would-be authoritarian is very much counting on being able to play us as fools. We may become so enamored with the leader's pattern of fighting hard for our values and interests that our loyal eyes fail to see that the health of our democracy is being degraded. Historian Richard Beeman has written, "Our Constitution is neither a self-actuating nor self-correcting document. It requires the constant attention and devotion of all citizens. If, due to polarization, we let our devotion to defeating the other party exceed our devotion to the principles of the Constitution, we may be beginning a journey of bidding farewell to freedom." Thank you. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Jerry. A lot of scary stuff. So I think we'll turn now to Dr. April Chatham Carpenter. April, can you help us as individuals with the role of communication and when preparing our communication with others across the political divide?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to break it up just a little bit. I wasn't planning on doing this, but I'm going to share a portion of my screen because I have a couple of slides that have some concepts on it that I think would be helpful for you to see. So I'm going to just a second get that where we can see it. So
while she's getting that ready, I just again want to remind people to enter questions into chat if you've got any while the speakers are speaking, and then we'll get to those questions at the end.
All right. So this is going to show up a little bit for you, I think. When we're thinking about polarization in conversations, and thank you so much for Glenn and for Jerry sharing this, but it made me reminded actually of a couple of concepts that I wasn't planning on talking about tonight, but I think are very helpful as we think about this. And these concepts are the concept of conversational receptiveness and conflict resilience. And these are both concepts that have been studied by sociologists as well as communication scholars. And I thought if I could just talk briefly about them, it really does show the connection of polarization and communication. the whole issue of conversational receptiveness is how willing we are to actually engage with the other. And what Jerry was talking about there at the end was that we really are showing that we are not willing if we're having that kind of competition with another. And so that just means it's kind of like a Texas and Oklahoma. Sorry, I'm from Oklahoma. We have a big game coming up this weekend. And it'd be like a Texas and Oklahoma people. We don't want to sit next to each other because it's bad blood there. But we have some bad blood going on in our nation right now, and we need to be willing to engage with the other, the people that are different from us. And that other person might not just be the person that's going to vote on the other side. It actually might be somebody on our own side that holds a more extreme position or a less extreme position than we do. And so I think it's important to be aware of conversational receptiveness. The second concept is conflict resilience. And this is like a muscle we build up as we are willing to be in conflict with another person, the ability to sit with another. And I actually wanted, this quote is just amazing, and I wanted to read it to you from a scholar named Bourdon. He says, when we sit in the presence of others with whom we may disagree strongly, but with whom we can maintain civility and curiosity, we inevitably discover domains of shared interest and connection. And even when we don't find these, we can often develop an appreciation for why our fellow citizens may hold the views that they do. This sitting with does not solve an immediate problem, but it prevents the kind of demonization and othering that can escalate and cause new problems down the road while promoting humanization and connection. And as I think about that, that really is what Braver Angels is all about. It offers us opportunities to be able to actually, in COVID times, sit across from each other, maybe not the same way as we would have done, but it offers us the opportunities to actually be in the presence of people who are different than us. And there is research that actually shows that coming in contact with a person and having a deep conversation with them, that a person that's different from us can actually reduce prejudice. So one of the things that we want to do when we're sitting in those conversations is to think about, and this is a Braver Angels term, it came out of John Gottman's research, who is a scholar, psychologist actually, who has studied marriage conflicts and what would cause marriages to break up, and Bill Doherty, who oversees the academic side of things and the training side of things at Braver Angels, actually adapted these from John Gottman's work. But we have stereotyping, dismissing, ridiculing, and contempt. And if you think about any time that you have not wanted to sit across from the other, sit with the other, usually in your mind somewhere, these four things are going to be present. I'm grouping them as only being part of a group. One group, not as a whole person that has many different interests. That's stereotyping. Dismissing is when I'm saying I'm not giving them a voice. I'm not even listening to them. I'm like, their voice isn't important. Ridiculing is when I'm making fun of them, either in my own heart or with other people. And contempt is when I really almost hate them. You just really feel that strong emotion against them. So if you look at those four things and try to identify in these communication contexts, and I'm going to identify here several of them, any of these communication contexts are places that we need to work on our communication when we're thinking about how can we actually decrease polarization in our own circles, whether it be in my own heart or my own conversations. So my own self-talk about others, that's such a powerful thing. What I say in my head about those other people creates some immediate reactions to them on Facebook, just as an example. How I actually talk about them with my own tribe or group, that reveals a lot of those horsemen of the polarization. And then, of course, what do I actually do when I'm in their presence? And so we often have to depolarize within before we can communicate well with the other. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I think you've got some more questions for me potentially, but I wanted just to throw those things out.
Right.
And I think sometimes visually it's more helpful to see them.
Definitely very helpful. Thank you. So we've got the role of communication in talking with others across the political divide. There's also the specific listening practices that are helpful. So I didn't know if you had something to address on the communication as well as the listening, or.
Absolutely. Anybody that whenever we teach listening in our classes, and I know I see a couple of professors here from the applied communication department, and when they teach listening and when we all teach it, there are just skill sets that we teach. So an example is paraphrasing. So whenever you're in a conversation with somebody that's different, rather than just assuming I'm going to think about the next thing I'm going to say, the next punch I'm going to give in order to be able to make my point, I have to really kind of just divest myself of my point and actually really think, what is it that they're saying? And that paraphrasing is not just the paraphrasing of the content of their saying, but also the feelings behind what they're saying. And so paraphrasing is something that is important. And the same process, being aware of your self-talk. What is it that you're saying? John Gottman's work talks about that oftentimes what happens whenever we feel criticized by another person is that we tend to get hostile inside. And so he calls it, the term he calls it is flooding in a marital relationship. When a person criticizes you, then automatically the thoughts that go through your head about that person become that idiot. I can't believe it. How did they even have that opinion? Where in the world did they get that? I don't even want anything to do with them. And so that self-talk that's happening in your head at the same time that you're listening to that person is something that you really, again, just have to divest yourself. And one of the things that I do to kind of remind myself of that's a listening skill that I like, actually, that one of the professors in my department shared when he was talking at a talk once, is to keep open hands. And so when I am in a difficult meeting, just as an example, individually, or maybe it's a faculty meeting in which I disagree vehemently with some of the things that are going to be said, I try to actually, under the table, I will put my hands and have them out open in front of me, because as soon as I open my hands, it's a posture of saying, I receive. I want to be able to actually listen and receive from you. And that's a different posture than the fight and flight kind of posture.
Yeah, that's excellent. Excellent. So how can we be assertive then about our own political opinions without being aggressive?
Yeah, this is really difficult because, especially as we're getting ready to near the election, it's hard to just listen, because you know in your mind, whichever side you stand on, that there's a lot at stake. We've heard that from both Glenn and from Jerry. And so if we think there's a lot at stake, and we're concerned about that security, and we're scared, there's fear of what will happen if the other side gets in power or stays in power, then we end up feeling like we've got to defend ourselves. So here, a couple of things that I would suggest in terms of speaking is to make sure that your messages are I messages. We talk about this in communication classes as well. So it means that I start my messages with I think, or I feel, or I this, as opposed to you are wrong, you are this. You can think about whenever you start feeling that pointing of the finger, then you've gotten off of those I messages, as opposed to I think this. Maybe it's not everybody thinks this, but I think this. And one of the things that helps in doing those I messages is to tell a story. And I recommend that you actually look for opportunities to both hear stories from the other, but also tell your own story. I was listening to a podcast this weekend that was put on by Braver Angels, and one of the things that the persons that were talking said is, I really want to hear your story. I want to know where you grew up. I want to know how you got to the place that you've got, not just physical geography space, but the place of where this is important and you're passionate about this. And so being able to also share that. And self-disclosure is one of those things where if I self-disclose, then there's almost like this norm of reciprocity that if I self-disclose, then somebody else is probably going to also want to self-disclose. So we kind of get this, I tell a story, well, then you'll tell a story, not to one up each other, but just to try to understand each other. And storytelling makes us human. It shows that we have more in common.
Get that momentum going within the groups. So great. Well, we're about 7 o'clock right now. What communication strategies that are taught by Braver Angels? I think you've already covered some of them in your discussion up till now. Are there some additional strategies that you find the most helpful?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Oliver, who's here, and I did some research actually this summer on one of the red-blue workshops that Braver Angels does that we're actually going to try to put on in the spring semester. And it's a 6-hour workshop, so we're kind of figuring out how we can schedule it. But we found actually 4 things that they do that I think are extremely interesting, and they do these in almost all of their workshops. And they have workshops on. We're going to have one this fall. Well, December, I guess it'll be in the winter by then. On depolarizing within. They have a bridging the skills workshop, a red-blue workshop, a how do you talk to your family and friends who are different than you workshop. I'm going to one this weekend that they're piloting on difficult dialogues about race. They are just all the time trying to create new things. But 4 things that our research has actually shown that I think are helpful. One is rapport building. The facilitator of those workshops really does an excellent job, and they teach you how to facilitate them so that you're building trust and a safe space with the people that are different from you in that workshop. A second thing that they almost always work on is perspective taking, trying to begin to think about, I may have my thoughts about you. I have certain thoughts that I think are right, but I'm telling a story in my own head. I think Brene Brown talks about the stories that we tell ourselves. So I tell a story in my head about what I think you're thinking or what I think you're believing, but I really don't know your perspective. So I really have to limit my assumptions and take your perspective. Active listening, as we talked about already, is something that they always encourage. And then locating shared interest or shared commonalities is something also that's a 4th skill that they really emphasize.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. With that concludes our panelists' initial discussions. Jeannie, do we have any questions in chat? You need to come off mute, Jeannie.
Hey, I thought I clicked that. All right. There are several. The first one is, I think it was kind of directed to Jerry, probably Jerry or Glenn. Since we are so deeply wired to tribalism, are there any behavioral activities that we can engage in to help us become more open and willing to listen?
Well, I think April just did a very good job. The reciprocity of self-disclosure is powerful. So if we can have a soft and open heart approaching a conversation that invites another person, that if we can develop a safe place and be compassionate, that's going to open their door if it's openable. And then as long as we are straightforward and non-judgmental, we can hopefully expect the same from the other person.
I would add too, remember when I was talking about the different type of processing systems, the fast and the slow, when you get that immediate emotional and tribal urge, that's the fast part, and that comes easy. That comes first. It has a lot of force to it. And the only way to engage the alternative is to slow everything down and start trying to use, rather than give in to that and go with your first instinctive assessment of the situation, try to think based on your values and the information you have, trying to use your higher level logic and rationality, saying, is there another way to look at this? Okay, and so you're trying to engage that slow brain processing system at that point. And of course, another way to do that too is to use some of those skills that April was talking about, the listening skills where you hear what they have to say, and instead of responding with something that's probably going to be at least challenging what they say or even provocative, you just kind of stop and say, well, ask another question. The key here, if you're asking that question, in your mind, you need to work on priming yourself to really be genuinely curious about how they got to that belief. Try to understand and ask questions, not gotcha questions, but questions that help you understand the details of why they think that way and where that came from. That would be another approach.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. We have a second question, and it is, I am interested in how to address dialogue civilly with someone who is politically different, who is using statements that are logically and rationally incorrect. How can we address these fallacies civilly during the dialogue, or is it suggested to not address them at all?
That's a great question. I want to turn that back to the person who asked it because I know her, but I think she sincerely probably wants the answer based on this. I figured she probably wouldn't want that. I'm going to see what Glenn and Jerry say about that. What do you think? Do you address their inaccuracies?
Well, my first thought is to use the very kind of skills that you were talking about and that we all have learned in Braver Angels and actually teach: listening skills and speaking skills. So in this case, you might start with a listening skill or reflecting what they said or paraphrases it. So it's your belief that blah, 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 blah. And in your mind, you think this is really wrong. Well, rather than say, well, that's just not true. That's hogwash because blah, blah, blah. That's going to set them off. It's going to make them more defensive. They're less likely to hear you. So you might say, okay, so you believe it that way. Here's my understanding of it. And then you, in a calm kind of way, say, my understanding from what I've heard is this, this, and this. And the reason I believe that and the sources I came from were that. And so that makes me think that actually may be what's going on. That would be, one approach that comes to my mind.
Good. All right. Another question that we have. What about when the boundaries of decency are broken, as in using cuss words to describe another group or assuming that I agree with them? How do I say that what is being said is unacceptable, as in racist, sexist, without concluding the discussion?
Yeah. So this is something that comes up in the literature on allies. When we think about being an ally of in a particular group, for a group of people. And I do think that when they're using swear words, that we can acknowledge at least the feelings behind those. So we might say, okay, well, it sounds like you feel pretty intensely about this, and it sounds like maybe even that you're angry or you're fearful related to this. Can you tell me a little bit more about that anger or fear? Sometimes I let them tell a little bit more when I'm in those kind of situations. But then I would have to say at some point, I understand that you're experiencing those emotions. I just do not feel comfortable when we call the other group and we demonize them, because then I don't have any chance at all of ever getting to know them as human beings. And I believe that everyone has imago Dei. I mean, I come from a religious perspective, but everyone is made in the image of a creator of some kind. And so, when I think about that, then that means that I come to you. I think about people who say namaste at the end of a conversation. It's like we are made to have those kind of relationships. And I just can't keep talking about the other like that. But I do understand that you're angry.
And I would, I'd probably wind up saying the same thing in different words that April just said, that the first step is to recognize their passion, their strong emotion, acknowledge that. And I would probably, my tendency, and I don't know if it's right or not, would be to sooner rather than later express, yeah, I hear you're real passionate about that. I got to admit, I feel some discomfort about that, and here's why. And then you focus on how your own values of trying to recognize the humanity in other people, even while you may have different opinions, is so important to you, and that you think it's important in order for us to reach a better place in our country, because without that, we go in a really bad direction. And just like, April mentioned something about religion, you can easily get into a discussion about, whether it's based on your particular religious belief or just recognizing some of the common elements in all the different religions around the world, that they all tend to have similar notions of trying to express and demonstrate love and respect for the other person, and appeal to basically to their higher values. Because at that point, when the person's doing that, you can be assured they are in that lower part of their brain. They're kind of not thinking through. So if you can kind of slow it down, lower the emotional temperature, and get them to be thinking about these higher level values, there might be a chance you go somewhere. I think that brings up another question I'm not going to get into, but at some point, there are some people out there who aren't going anywhere but where they are. And I think we've all faced that dilemma about how long do you persist in trying to engage with someone, and when do you decide you're throwing good money after bad and move on?
Yeah. One takeaway that I just loved that April said was the phrase, "tell me your story." And I think one of the best ways to, manifest some of the things that Glenn and April and Jerry have talked about, recognizing, the humanness, of the other person, respecting them, even though you might not agree. Just to start off with, tell me your story. To be a good listener is a gift. And I think that's a wonderful thing that April said. So appreciate that, April. We do have another couple of questions here. One person has directed a question for Jerry, and it says, Jerry, do you believe that Donald Trump is an authoritarian that needs to be stopped before he and his administration does more harm to our democratic institutions?
So before Jerry answers that question, I'm just interrupt, and I just want to say that normally in our groups, we have both reds and blues represented. And so we try not to talk a lot about candidates because it can create, without the opportunity to be able to have the more deeper discussions. But I would be interested in hearing Jerry's response. I think we'll just have to be careful, Jerry. And you might have to temper it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think that it would be appropriate for us in this type of setting to start talking about individual candidates. I think it's important to realize if you're a red, you're going to have one outlook on the answer to that question. And if you're a blue, you might have another one. But I think we can all be asking the questions about what is the health of our democracy in terms of what kind of candidate nurtures our democracy and what kind of candidate may not. And that's about all I have to say.
Thank you, Jerry.
And I would just urge you to look at the information. Jerry gave a lot of good information. Look at that and think about the very different features that go along with authoritarian or other kinds of things that are associated with poor outcomes, and then use that information and those qualities to judge the various candidates that you encounter, not just Donald Trump or Joe Biden, but everyone, and try to see where they're coming from. What is their overall standard? What is their overall approach to things? And that's important information. And of course, if you're doing that kind of analysis and listening carefully, once again, you're using the slower processing system, and then are less susceptible to being kind of manipulated by the emotional stuff.
Okay. One of our participants has made the kind of a comment that we seem to be more polarized now, but also goes on to say that they feel skeptical about how much good it can do, because they think serious polarization is actually the default position, and that polarization tends to resolve itself temporarily when only if one side wins a decisive victory at the ballot box. I think that was really more of a comment than a question. We do have another one here, though, that says, does anyone or Braver Angels have any history on how we got up to our current state of polarization that might help us understand this better or help us?
I think one thing that has been argued is when the Congress started spending more time at home and not living in DC, because when they were in DC, they went to lots of social events together, and that was conducive to forming relationships across the aisle and seeing the other person as human. So that's one element I think that's been talked about before as perhaps responsible for the increase in polarization over time, at least at the federal government level. And then I think another thing that could be argued, many people do, is that the Supreme Court decision to allow basically money to be equated to speech. In my mind, the metaphor I think of is everybody has free speech, and you go into the public square and start talking, except somebody comes in with a huge public address system and bullhorn and drowns everybody else out. And in many ways, money has that impact.
Okay, thank you. Another question, does Braver Angels do specific training on handling issues on a specific topic, such as climate change?
And yes, actually it does. They have a really good partnership with the Citizens Climate Lobby. I know Katie, who's one of the people that's on here, is actually working in Arkansas with the Citizens Climate Lobby. So perhaps could tell you more about that if you're not familiar.
Definitely. Just to jump in, if y'all have anything that y'all want to ask me about after the meeting, one of us can get you my contact information. If not me, I'm actually on one of their calls right now as well. So I'm definitely multitasking, but yeah, if you need to know anything about them, I can help y'all with that.
So one of the things that they do sometimes is they actually, I've been a part of a workshop that they designed to actually where the dialogue points or the example things that you're supposed to talk about with your partner are actually climate issues. So I did one, I know with the Depolarizing Within, that they actually looked at climate issues. And so, yes, they do specific training on that, on specific topics. They also have one-to-one conversation guides. If you actually become a member of Braver Angels, which only cost, it's a minimum of $12 a year, which is incredibly cheap, then you can have access to all of their members portal information, including their training materials. And so you can be able to see what kinds of things that they do. There's opportunities to get involved as being a moderator, as being somebody that works on their Zoom end of things. And one of the things that I think is kind of fun, and I think they've done one on climate change recently, actually, and Glenn, you might be able to answer this. They do debates, and those of us who are in speech, I find the debates interesting. They're just a 2 to 3 hour commitment of time, and there are probably 200 people that participate in these, and they put them into multiple Zoom rooms, and then you have breakout rooms within that in which you're having people that discuss, and it's parliamentary style debate. So you're always speaking through a moderator or through a madam or a master chairman, and they have equal number of times on both sides for people to speak for and against the specific thing that they're talking about. But anyway, just amazing materials if you do join to get, and there's some stuff just open source stuff too on their
Another question
site.
we have is, are there any suggestions on how we address those in our own tribe who are being unfairly polarizing?
Glenn, Jerry?
Jerry, you're muted. Unmute yourself.
I'm not sure I understand the question about what is unfair. But Glenn, did you have some thoughts?
Well, would you repeat the question, please?
Sure. One person posed the question that how do you handle it how do you address those who are in like your own tribe, who seem to be unfairly polarizing?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a tough one. And I would say the first thing is you're going to have some courage to do that, because you're going against all the instincts that human beings have to not go against your tribe. You don't want to be cast out into the wilderness and be eaten by a lion because you disagree, right? Okay, here's one kind of self-centered kind of suggestion. Tell them about Braver Angels and have them join. It says, you know, I have been talking this way myself too, but I have joined this organization called Braver Angels, and I'm learning about the polarization, and I think it'd be really helpful to join that and learn some of these things, because it actually turns out when we're being really antagonistic and polarized toward the other side, even though we may be largely right, it winds up being unproductive in persuading someone else. You don't need to persuade me. You don't need to persuade anyone in this room. We need to be able to reach out to people, at least some people in the middle who are willing to be persuaded. And the way to do that is going to be to learn some of the things that Braver Angels offers, because, you know, doing the kind of things we talk just amongst ourselves in our tribe is not going to get us anywhere. We're already where we are. We need to be able to talk across the aisle and to people who are undecided or see some things both ways.
All right, so Deborah just got finished going through, I think, the workshop Depolarizing Within. Didn't you, Deborah? Did you say that you had?
Yes, and I just wrote in that process LAP or LAPP was really good for addressing people in our tribe that are acting out or stereotyping or ridiculing, all of that, those 4 hearts.
I just put the pre-training. There's a 40-minute pre-training for that workshop that you can take with free if you want to take a look at that and kind of get an idea of that. We're going to be offering that workshop, though. You do need to do the pre-training in order to be able to participate fully in it. But we're going to be offering that workshop Monday night, December the 7th. Is that right, Jeannie? Check the dates for me. Okay, Monday night, December 7th. And actually, I'm going to be moderating that workshop along with another national leader who is from the East Coast. And so we will be talking about lots of strategies for that.
I don't see any other questions.
Amy's asked a question of Josh, so I don't know if Josh could respond back maybe to her individually.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
So
probably about time for the poll, isn't it?
I was just going to say, I think we're running up on time now, that it's time to conduct our ending poll, April.
All right, well, let's do it. So let me go to the polls and pull up the second one here. And should have the first 5 questions the same, and then there's a question about the workshop. Again, these are anonymous, so I'm going to launch that. We lost a couple of people out of the pool, but 16 of you, it looks like, can go ahead and be answering the poll, and we'll see if we got any differences. %80 in so far. Give you about another 20 seconds. All right, should I go ahead and close the poll? We got 12 out of 15.
That'll do it.
All right. And I think you guys have to actually scroll up yourself to be able to see this based on the comments from the last time. So, hey, we've moved some people up, it looks like, in terms of your knowledge levels. In terms of your political views, sound information, looks like that, I think we moved up a little bit on that, but maybe not a whole lot. I'm not surprised on that one necessarily. This next one is interesting. We actually have about, I think we have some more negativity a little bit, maybe on this one after we heard about polarization, but withstanding, you know, that we're actually going to make it through. But you do have more confidence in your ability to have respectful and effective conversations with someone, as well as your current knowledge. Seem like you've got more knowledge as well, so that's good. And you're pretty satisfied with the workshop overall. So I'm going to stop sharing that. Everybody get a chance to take a look at those?
I actually
Okay.
didn't see it. It kind of disappeared from my screen. So after I got like my first screen capture, hopefully we'll
All right.
get
Well,
together.
let's stay on afterwards, Glenn, and I'll show it to you
Yeah.
again.
Sounds good.
So where we go from here, Jeannie? Are you moving us to the end? You're
Once she
muted.
unmutes herself.
Yes. Okay, sorry. It looks like we don't have any other questions. I would just encourage everyone to, in your chat, scroll back up to the top and take a look at those links. There's a lot of good information shared in our chat today, but we have a link to Jerry's article there. We have the Braver Angels website, our Facebook page, YouTube channel, Dr. White's contact information, Dr. Carpenter's contact information, and then I think some other people, you know, there were a couple of other links that were shared in the chat, and Katie also shared her contact information about the climate group, Citizens Climate Group. So,
Jeannie, I would also add, also in there were links to 2 different surveys. We've got an initial interest survey and a volunteer survey, and that's just, if you want to know more
Yes.
about us or want us to know about it, be sure to let us know. We could use some volunteers to help out with a few things if you'd be interested.
yes.
And then we've got some upcoming workshops. You want to tell us about? We kind of have hit the December one hard. November one. Should I talk about that briefly?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, April?
So we're actually going to do on the night before the election, the voting for on November 3rd and November 2nd, we will have a meeting that we will be practicing one-to-one conversations. And I'm actually going to try to pair you with somebody from the other side, and we're going to give you some specific questions so that you can actually hear the stories of the other and not just talk about policy, but to try to see if there's an ability to have some common ground. And that's also from 6 to 7:30 Central Time. I know a couple of you called in from California, but if you're interested and you would like to have more information about that, then you can certainly email me and I will send you information about that. Stacy says that she is not finding the links just mentioned, so we might want to copy and paste all of that at the bottom too. I think she may have joined after we got started. So we are so excited to have had you all here tonight. I will tell you, this Braver Angels organization has really kind of put my life in a little bit of a tailspin. I'll just be honest. I really was not a politics junkie. And so when I heard about the opportunity to learn to talk to people from the other side, in my family, we didn't talk about religion and politics because it would create, well, we talked about religion some, but not politics very much because it would create so much conflict. And it is just, this has given me some tools to be able to actually have the difficult conversations, both on my own side and also on the side, the other, with other people. And I've met some really good friends from doing this, not just in the state of Arkansas, but certainly sitting here around me, I've met some good friends, but also across the nation. Because of COVID, there are all kinds of workshops that Braver Angels puts on that you can attend. I've attended ones held out of California, one held out of Nashville, Tennessee, met people from all over the US that also have the desire that Braver Angels does, which is to try to create relationships across the political divide in order to be able to humanize each other, with the goal of trying to create ways of making us better, not just be polarized. So
let me add one thought too, that it's important to remember that this issue of polarization is not going away after the election just because someone wins. It's going to continue, and so we're going to have many challenges as a country in the coming months and probably years as well. Hopefully it'll get better, but the one way we are sure that it will get better is if many citizens from the grassroots level take it upon themselves to do something about that. And we believe that the approach that Braver Angels offers is one that is more likely to result in a healthy, functioning democracy, improved relationships across the political divide. And we would encourage you all to do what you can to make those changes in your own relationships, in your own life, and in a larger way. So keep following us, get involved, and do what you can on your individual level. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Excellent, excellent information.
thank you for coming. So I think those of us who are the panelists are kind of stay on, but the rest of you all, thank you and good night and stay safe.